our intent with this session today is just to provide a basic understanding of wilderness character. It's such a central concept for wilderness and our jobs as wilderness stewards, but trying to really understand and get into the deeper meaning of what it is. There's lots of nuances, so I'm hoping that today we can start to address some of those factors. So we're going to talk about kind of why it's important and what it is, and then how it's used in the framework that was used to help operationalize this concept and make it practical for those of us that are working to steward wilderness. So the first thing here is I'm really curious with basically 90 folks that we have in the room is where are you, how are you involved with wilderness character today? And so Jacob, if you could open up the poll question, we'll get some responses. It looks like we've got a really good spread of folks involved at different levels with this concept. And that'll be helpful. Is I would encourage those of you that have been working with wilderness character for a while to be looking at the chat and responding to other folks' questions too, so that we make this as interactive as possible. But not surprisingly is a lot of folks have been introduced to the concept but don't totally understand it yet. And so in terms of where my involvement is, I started working with a group of Forest Service folks, I think in 2001 or 2002, and we were given the charge of coming up with a monitoring program for wilderness that would fit with the agency's efforts to improve monitoring for all lands. And obviously, wilderness is about 20% of our land base. And so worked for the next, 15 to 18 years developing the first framework for the Forest Service, and then working at an interagency basis to develop the Keeping It Wild framework, the Keeping It Wild 2, and then also helping with the tech guides for the Forest Service. So, so I have been involved with this concept for a while, tons of discussions around it, and hoping that I can impart some of that to you today. So why do we care about this concept? Well, the short answer is it's the law. It's the central mandate of the Wilderness Act that says in many places throughout the Act that these areas shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people in such manners will leave them unimpaired for future use and enjoyment, and to provide for the protection and the preservation of their wilderness character. In many of the challenges that have come up to various wilderness decisions, the courts always go back to this phrase, is that this is our ultimate stewardship mandate. And so it's a little surprising that it wasn't really until 2000 that we paid much attention to, okay, so what does this mean for our work and things? And furthermore, in the writings of Howard Zonheiser, the primary author of the Act, is he noted that the purpose of the Wilderness Act is to preserve the wilderness character of these areas, not to establish any particular use. So it was, the idea was that it was something more holistic, something broader than any particular use. And the other thing that's kind of cool about this is that oftentimes in the wilderness program, there's a focus on what is prohibited in wilderness. We don't often talk about what is, what's the vision for these areas. This concept allows us to help create a positive vision. What are we really managing for and things? And so it can be a rallying cry for what we're trying to protect ultimately in these areas. So why are we developing this concept and trying to operationalize it? Well, ultimately, what our job is, and we want to try to improve stewardship. This concept allows us to operationalize and link our actions directly to the law. Are we maintaining wilderness character? Is the trend upward, downward, or relatively stable? We also, another thing I think that's important here is that in the past, a lot of our wilderness activities were really very isolated. You know, we were dealing with kind of recreation effects, or we were dealing with fire, or we were dealing with wildlife issues or invasive plants and things. We didn't have a way to pull all that together and say, okay, what does that mean in terms of whether or not we're upholding the law and things. And so this framework allows us to do some of that. Again, the importance of this concept has been conveyed in when the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act occurred in 2014. All four of the main federal agencies signed on to this vision for the future. And the first priority was to complete these wilderness character inventories across the entire system using standardized protocols and things. So it is something that we've really been paying attention to over the last 5 years. So how do we try to operationalize this? I really do encourage people, if they have not yet found this publication, Keeping It Wild 2, and this was the second, basically the updated version of the interagency strategy to monitor trends. And so it includes the lessons learned after the first edition was published. But the thing that's interesting is wilderness character is not explicitly defined in the Wilderness Act. And so we need to operationalize that. The legal scholars and others say that Section 2C, which is the definition of wilderness, is the best approximation of wilderness character, and it can lead to at least grabbing onto the tangible, more defined aspects of wilderness character. And out of that definition comes 5 very key qualities of that we can attribute to what wilderness character is. So in a holistic sense, this is the definition that we're using. And it really is based on these 3 interrelated concepts. There's nothing particularly different necessarily about the plants or the animals or the air in a wilderness, but because it's designated and has this mandate to preserve wilderness character, we are responsible for providing a biophysical environment that's primarily free from modern human manipulation and impact. We have a responsibility to provide the opportunity for these personal experiences in a natural environment that's relatively free from the signs of modern society. And it also has this symbolic meanings of humility, restraint, and interdependence that inspire the connection with nature. And so it's really the interaction of those 3 concepts that make up what wilderness character is. So it's this elusive beast out there that is, and the plain meaning of the word character is just what distinguishes something from something else. And we talk about colorful characters that are out there that we know. But in terms of wilderness, there are 4 qualities that apply to every single wilderness: the untrammeled quality, the undeveloped quality, the natural quality, and outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. There also is a fifth quality that may apply, but it doesn't necessarily have to apply. And that is called the other features of value. So we're going to go into each of these a little bit. So with the untrammeled quality, the interesting thing about this one is that it's a central part of defining what wilderness is. And yet in the past, we've often treated the untrammeled quality the same as naturalness, and we didn't really separate those two. And that led to some confusion about when we were talking about things. But this comes from the Act where it says that ideally, wilderness is a place where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. And it's a place that is free from modern human control or manipulation and things. This is really well expressed in a number of different writings, but Roger Nash talks about wilderness preservation is a gesture of planetary modesty, an ethical expression and demonstration of our capacity for self-restraint. And I think if nothing else, a central concept about wilderness that sets it apart from other lands is that this is a place that we approach with humility and restraint. It's just such an important concept. The thing that and so what do we do that affects this is we know that the untrammeled quality is degraded by actions that manipulate the biophysical environment. Again, this is talking to whether or not the earth and its community of life are untrammeled. So we're really talking about the natural processes that and other life forms that exist in that place. And are we doing things to remove animals, to add animals, to manipulate a natural fire process or manipulate a water flow and things. And so those are the kinds of action. This quality is really speaking to what we do as managers, not so much what the visitors are doing and things. And there also can be non-authorized actions that manipulate the environment. And this could be something like people going out with buckets and putting fish in, non-native fish in the streams. So the natural quality, this has always been a tough one to define, but the Wilderness Act talks about that wilderness is land that retains its primeval character and is protected and managed to preserve its natural conditions. And the thing that is tough here is that we can argue all day about what is natural. And it's a dynamic system. And so we really can't say what conditions ought to be like. We have a pretty short time span that we're looking at, and it's hard to say if you look at long geological scale of what exactly are natural conditions or not. But ultimately, I think there's three important things, is that we want to keep all the parts that were there historically. We want to keep the invasive things out, and we want to allow natural processes to function. And so the way that we approach this, rather than trying to say what is natural, we focus the indicators on those things that pose a threat to that natural quality. So you'll see the indicators are related to air, plants or animals, grazing allotments, altered disturbance regimes, and climate change. And obviously there's a lot of discussion going on around, really trying to understand climate change and understanding disturbance regimes. and things. That still is really, really tricky.
Linda, that was a kind of a good quick segue. If you don't mind me pausing you, there was a question about, is there any consideration to climate change as human caused force that is degrading the untrammeled quality of wilderness character? Yeah. And any thoughts on that?
Yes, good question. And again, let me go back just one quick thing, is that the untrammeled quality, what we're really trying to get at here is the intentional actions that managers take that end up manipulating the environment. Climate change is not something that we're intentionally doing, as managers inside the wilderness, but we are very much acknowledging that climate change beyond, that occurs certainly beyond wilderness boundaries, is affecting these areas. And so that's why it's captured in the natural quality here rather than the untrammeled quality.
And one more quick one while I have you, Linda. Would stocking native fish to maintain a native population be considered trammeling? Or is it just in regard to non-native species?
It still would be, you're manipulating a native population by adding additional animals. And again, the idea here, and I probably should say this at the beginning, we're not making judgments here about what is good or bad, but we need to be able to acknowledge that that by adding things from the outside or removing things, that we are potentially manipulating the system, and it's our responsibility to at least disclose what's happening there and the potential effects. So this natural quality, think of the untrammeled quality is about whether or not we're taking action. The natural quality is talking about the effects of some of these kinds of actions.
Thanks, Linda. That's a great answer.
Okay, the undeveloped quality is, the Wilderness Act talks about that wilderness is in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape. It's undeveloped federal land without permanent improvements or human habitation and things. And so this one is probably the easiest to understand, is wilderness is free of improvements and things. The thing that is unique about this quality is that this is where the use of motorized equipment or mechanical transport end up coming in and things. And the reason for this is that kind of a bonus question. A lot of people miss this, is why is mechanization included in the undeveloped quality and not under, like solitude? Isn't it just the noise from these things that disrupts visitors that we're concerned about? The reason it's in the undeveloped quality really goes back to the purpose of the Wilderness Act. And if you recall from earlier sessions, the purpose of the Wilderness Act is to assure that an increasing population accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization does not occupy and modify all areas. And so it was really, the authors were talking about the settlement and mechanization was the means by which we occupied and modified land. And so that's why that prohibition is in the Wilderness Act. And Howard Zonheiser further said that, quoting, "There is a need for areas of the earth where we stand without the mechanisms that make us immediate masters of our environment." And so this prohibition on motorized equipment and mechanical transport is all because those tools were what allowed us to occupy and modify land. And so that's why it's included in the undeveloped quality. So what we track in this is structures or installations. And structures are typically buildings and things like that. Installations tends to refer to instrumentation and things like that. Here's where we track the use of any use of motorized vehicles, motorized equipment, or mechanical transport. And then we also do track in-holdings. And because they obviously have the potential to lead to development within a wilderness. And then, of course, the outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. And again, our goal here is to provide outstanding opportunities that allows people to choose. We're not prescribing that you have a good time, but you're at least afforded that opportunity. And also want to reiterate here that when you go back and read a lot of the writings about wilderness, is there wasn't a sense that solitude didn't necessarily mean being alone. The central concept around solitude was that it allows you to separate from modern civilization and be allowed for some escape from the sounds and sights of modern civilization that would then afford the opportunity for personal growth, self-discovery, some sense of freedom, some sense that you're in control of your own time rather than a societal obligation. And so that's really what we're trying to get at in providing this kind of a rich experience. And so this quality is obviously is affected by the sounds and sights of people inside the wilderness. And so that's why that relatively low encounter rates is still important, because if you're going to have a sense of being in control of your own time and being able to just immerse yourself in where you're at and feel a connection to a place, it's hard to do that if you're surrounded by a zillion other people trying to do the same thing. It also is degraded by in terms of a primitive kind of experience, facilities that decrease self-reliance. And then in terms of unconfined, it is degraded by management restrictions that restrict visitor behavior. And of course, we need to do some of these things, but there's trade-offs. Another thing that a lot of people are starting to work with is, if we're trying to provide an opportunity to escape the sounds and sights of modern civilization, there's a lot of work now being done with soundscapes and light pollution that really does affect the qualities inside wilderness. And so being able to track that is increasingly becoming important. And then finally, again, this quality is the one that may apply. It doesn't have to apply, because it says in the Act that wilderness may provide unique ecological or geological features that have, and those ecological and geological features may have these values of science, education, historical value, and things. And so what we try to do here is look at oh, I'm sorry, I'll go back to this one, is the challenge here is to determine, are there geological or cultural or historic features within that wilderness that really add and give extra meaning to what that wilderness is about and helps distinguish it from other places. And that's very true of some wildernesses, but not true of all wildernesses. And so the things that we track here are, is there any kind of degradation to these are people vandalizing or are they looting these very special features? So one thing I wanted to mention is that there obviously are some interactions between these qualities when we're looking at a particular action or a particular situation. Is here, there's a stream channel that has been significantly widened because of human activity, and it might be, so there could be potential water quality effects, there could be effects to a trout species. And so oftentimes what we might prescribe here is that in order to deal with this situation, we need to provide a bridge so that people aren't beating down those stream banks. But there's a trade-off. And what is lost is that opportunity for trying to figure out how to cross that stream safely and navigate on using your own skills. And so, again, there's no right or wrong, but you need to be able to talk about what are the trade-offs and what is the best course of action for wilderness character in this particular kind of a situation. And depending on where you are and what the context is, the answer is going to vary. So I wanted to just touch on some really key points to understand this concept, because it does get a little bit complicated. Is, again, the focus is on those tangible attributes that we can actually measure in some way. We're not trying to capture those symbolic meanings that are attached to wilderness. The concept of wilderness character applies to every single wilderness. It's going to look different by different wildernesses, but the concept applies to every wilderness. And importantly, and this was something that we really worked hard to develop, is each wilderness is compared to itself over time. Wildernesses are not compared against each other. The only thing that we're comparing is the trend for that particular wilderness against itself over time. We're not comparing wildernesses. And also, really, really importantly, it doesn't fulfill necessarily all the monitoring that might need to be done in a particular wilderness. In particular, if you're working with outfitter guides or special use permits, it isn't doing any of the monitoring relative to compliance with terms and conditions of an outfitter guide permit and things. That's additional monitoring that might be necessary, but doesn't necessarily apply to every wilderness. And then lastly, all 5 of these qualities are considered equally important and contributing to wilderness character. The untrammeled quality is given slightly more weight. And I'll mention that here in terms of how this is all pulled together. And then ideally, the baseline would be at the time of designation. But practically, it's probably the first time that you apply this framework to the area. If you've got really good legacy data from old records, you might be able to go back and reconstruct things. But what we're finding is typically it's the first time the framework is applied. And then also in developing this framework, again, we're trying to develop something that is useful, pulling together a picture at national and regional levels, but also is relevant to the local forest. And so there's going to be a little compromise between those two needs. Is the way that it worked out is obviously wilderness character applies across the entire system. The qualities all apply across the system. The monitoring questions are the same, and those indicators that I just went through for each of the qualities are the same across all 4 federal agencies. The measures that are used for those indicators vary by every agency has approached that a little differently depending on what data sources they have available what seems to be relevant. So we locally have the ability to select from kind of a suite of measures. And if I would encourage you, if you're working on any kind of developing the wilderness character baselines, you will be going through selecting the measures that make sense for your individual area. So that was a way to try to develop some balancing between national consistency and local relevance. And then also, again, just emphasizing that you know, we have all these different parts of the 5 qualities that we are tracking, but and we can pull those together to give an approximation, but it's not capturing the entire thing. Again, there's these intangibles and symbolic things that we can't really get at. And so there are some deeper, richer pieces of the story. We try to capture that by describing what we call the wilderness character narrative, to develop a story about what that place, what that individual wilderness is, what makes, what distinguishes that wilderness from another area, and that's in terms of its wilderness character. So what gives it meaning and is unique. So then this isn't useful unless you can pull it all together. So you have the 5 qualities, the monitoring questions, and the indicators. And again, these are consistent across the entire National Wilderness Preservation System. And then we've got these individual measures. So when we pull it all together, again, all we're tracking is the trend, not, you know, the absolute numbers. And so over time, one thing I should mention is some of these measures are tracked annually. Some are just every 5 years, but we try to pull these reports together and pull together a 5-year picture of what things look like. So maybe the number of actions that have been taken in that wilderness over a 5-year period has gone up. Then that means the indicator has gone up. And if the number of unauthorized actions has stayed pretty steady, then the overall trend in the question is up, the quality is up. And you just go through a business rule of you can see that here, the untrammeled quality is up. There's an improving trend. The natural quality is downward. There's a declining trend. The undeveloped quality is trending towards improvement, and solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation is some aspects are improving, some are declining. And so in essence, what this means is that it's a stable trend here. And so you've got 2 up and 1, actually you have 3 arrows going up that are improving, 1 going down, 1 stable. So the overall trend for that particular wilderness in that 5-year period is improving. And so there's nothing magic about that. It's just a basic business rule to try to pull together disparate kind of information. And then out of this, we can produce just automated reports every 5 years that combine and display some of the key information, and then allows people to write a short narrative about what's happening, so that at the local level, you can see what's happening in any of the individual qualities, what's happening in the particular measures, and then regionally and nationally, they can see whether this overall trends, are there patterns of where the trend in wilderness character is declining, and places where it's improving. Much like in the Forest Service, we use the wilderness stewardship performance. We can track trends, and that can be a really powerful tool for influencing policy. Thanks. So one last poll question is curious of how you think you might incorporate wilderness character into your work. And there's a lot of ways you can do this. It doesn't have to be just in a monitoring context. So I'm really pleased to see the wide variety of responses here is I really do encourage using the concept of wilderness character into training or with public education and interpretation programs is particularly if you're working at the field level I really encourage you to look at, has there been a wilderness character narrative drafted for your particular wilderness? What does this concept mean for the place that you're working? And what makes that wilderness special and unique within a larger region? And use that to talk about why this place is special and valuable. And so there's a lot of ways that that can be incorporated into public education and interpretation programs. I hope that folks are, if you're working in wilderness, is helping to contribute to the monitoring and gathering the data that's needed for the different wilderness character measures, and being able to pull together for the public kind of what is the state of your wilderness. This framework allows us to pull together a lot of that information. So thank you very much for that, for those responses. And here's a place where if you're interested in learning more, wilderness.net, there is a toolbox specifically related to wilderness character. All of the technical guides, there's a technical guide that's been developed for every agency. And obviously in the Forest Service, Julie King and others have, and Jacob Wall have provided a huge number of documents on the external wilderness character pinion folders that offer just tremendous resources for helping to get started with all of this. So with that, just any questions that still are on your mind?
Yeah, and we've got about 7 minutes or so. So feel free to either put something in the chat or go off mute and try that. And we'll see if we have any live questions. Otherwise, I might revisit a couple that I kind of managed throughout the chat on the second half of your presentation, Linda.
Okay, perfect.
Hey, Linda, Pete Irvin.
Oh, hi, Pete.
How are you? Great
Good.
to hear. Hey, wondering your thoughts on whether the wilderness character narratives that every wilderness is in the process of developing as part of wilderness character monitoring should be internal documents or external, available to the public documents.
I may be biased, Pete, but I strongly think that they should be public documents. I think that the more that we can talk to people about what we're trying to protect, what makes this place particularly unique and special, and communicate that, it helps people develop a story around. Now, a lot of our areas were designated many, many years ago, and to try to keep that story alive, I think the wilderness character narrative can really help with that.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Strongly agree. Have a concern that we're developing these without that, and that it wasn't made clear when we dove deep into developing sort of standardized wilderness character narratives, whether they were going to be internal or external. So I think we've invented a problem for ourselves.
Yeah, we, I mean, there's not a public comment process, but when we started the wilderness character baseline and selecting the measures, we did a little public presentation with the wilderness fellows that we had working with us that summer, and just talked to people about it. We did have people coming up and saying that, you know, they were intimately familiar with these areas, and some of them were writers, professional writers. And so, you know, can you, we asked for them to contribute to helping develop that narrative and what that story is.
Thanks.
Linda, this is Peter Malley. Well, first of all, can you
hi.
hear me?
Hi, Peter.
So I just wanted to follow on to Pete Irvine's question, not just because both of our names are Peter, but do you have any advice on how to characterize the rolled up results, whether that's for each agency on its own or even a national picture, how to roll that out for decision makers who will be in charge whenever it is we get let's say an agency by agency picture. I am a little concerned about the human dimension of the Forest Service chief or BLM director, whatever the figure is. Let's just pick one. 53% of Forest Service wilderness areas are being managed to standard, or, you know, wilderness character is stable or improving. I'm a little bit concerned that the manager will regard that as a comment on her or his performance, and if the result is if the figure is low, let's say under 50%, that she or he will want to either not release the result, or really give it a very shall we say soft release, not highlight the release because they are afraid it would reflect poorly on their performance.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of thought for that or any advice to give?
Boy, I think that's all about when you've got results that might be controversial, of figuring out how you're going to message that. And in particular, I don't think that that's any different than when the Wilderness Stewardship Performance and the 10-year challenge started to roll out within the Forest Service. It didn't look very good wildernesses were not meeting standard, or not even close. And so the WAG took that and developed a really effective presentation to the chief on what we needed to do to improve scores, and diving into not just the score itself, or, you know, what percent of wildernesses are showing a stable or improving trend, but why are some not doing as well? What's behind that that trend in the numbers, and what are the things that we could do as an agency to show the leadership and step up to improve the situation? So I think that you can tell that story effectively. And certainly WAG has done that in the past.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
So we've got 1 minute left and a couple of very last minute questions. And I responded to one, just maybe I'll talk to these real quickly. Nick, I'd recommend looking into a wilderness character monitoring course. He had a question about the national consistency versus the local relevance and preserving wilderness character. And he might want to get more involved in a wilderness character monitoring session. We had one question about, does one outweigh more than others? And you mentioned specifically that they're usually generally evenly weighted, with the untrammeled quality maybe carrying a little extra weight in some cases. But he was in regards to basically invasive species. And I think we're getting into the minimum requirements analysis a little bit, and weighing some of those qualities when you're looking at impacts maybe. And what's, you know, how do we balance, you know, competing species, that type of stuff. Right.
And there's again, I have not, since this was just trying to give an overview of the concept of wilderness character, I have not dived into, there's a lot of detail when you get into the individual measures. And when you look at the tech guide of talking about, what is, things are given a higher weight if they're like more impactive. If you've got invasive species. So there's ways to account for that when you're doing the individual measures. When you get to the, and then again, all of that is rolled up into the different, how it relates to then the qualities. The untrammeled quality is given more weight if basically everything else evens out, and then the trend in the untrammeled quality becomes the overall wilderness character trend, and that's why that's how it's given a little more weight. It's just if everything else equals out.
Great.
But
We're a
I'd
minute-
encourage you to dive into, I know there's other sessions that go more into the monitoring. If you there's a lot of nuance and detail in terms of how measures are actually counted and significance of different kinds of impacts. So there are ways to get at that.
I appreciate that, and you're right on, Linda. So we're about 1 minute long. Everyone, please thank Linda